Yep, cool. So today's paper is about neural processes. So it's as many approaches, it's trying to find a good compromise between purely Bayesian methods and pure deep learning methods. It is very interesting. It's a bit complex in the maths, but I'm sure Dan is going to be able to walk us through it as he is a mathematician. Just for context, Dan is a data scientist at Enplan, and well, he enjoys all the math behind all these deep learning approaches. Go for it.
Cool. So I'll share my screen and okay, and we can get started. So can everyone see that? Is that okay? Yeah, cool. I'm getting a thumbs up from Joao, so I'm just gonna forge ahead. Yeah, like Carlos says, I'm a data scientist at Enplan, and even though looking at networks isn't necessarily what I do on a day-to-day basis, I am quite interested in architecture of neural networks as well. So I found this paper and I thought it would be interesting to talk about it, especially in light of Arvid's discussion a few weeks ago about Gaussian processes and the sort of pros and cons behind them. I thought it'd be interesting to talk about this extension of or continuation of Gaussian processes into a neural network space. So yeah, I think it's quite an interesting paper, as Carlos says, and let's see how far we can get with it and how much we can understand, I suppose. And as Carlos says, if anyone's got any questions in the middle, please feel free to stick a hand up and we'll see where we get to. All right, cool. So the paper starts by talking about Gaussian processes and how they can be useful for inferring across a space or a distribution of functions. So talking about the likelihood of seeing a certain function and how that contrasts to a neural network where we are performing regression or classification, but we're doing it without any kind of knowledge of the likelihood of seeing a certain result. So yeah, you can see the pros and cons of the output of each of these approaches. And there's also pros and cons in terms of training each of these approaches. With a Gaussian process, we train and test together, I suppose. We fit the process to the data, all of the data at once, and we make our inferences from that. Whereas with neural networks, we have our training data and we fit our network to that data. And so we've done a lot of the processing before we actually see our unknown data. So they speak here about the different costs between neural networks, which scale in this way, as opposed to the expensive Gaussian process that scales pretty cubically with the data that it's seeing. So yeah, that's how they introduce the problem. And they then sort of take a step back and talk about what a stochastic process is. So as Carlos said, it's a little bit mathsy. Hopefully I can explain in a good enough way that we can kind of get an understanding of it. So they talk about a random function, which they denote capital F, and what that is, they interchangeably use that as a distribution over functions as well, right? So we are talking about the functions that map from this set X to the set Y, and the likelihood of seeing a certain function in that set. And that's what the distribution is. So they then go on to give a definition, a sort of mathematical definition of what these processes are. So it requires that the probabilities observed with these functions adhere to a couple of properties. So one of these properties is exchangeability. So they're basically saying it doesn't matter what order we look at our points within our domain of the function x, the likelihood of seeing a certain function should be equal, right? So you can exchange the points and put them in any order, and the function should have the same likelihood, right? And consistency. So they're saying if we look at a subset of our points, so if we look at the likelihood of a function given a large set of points, so they denote that 1 to n, and then look at the likelihood of a function given a smaller subset of those points, which is 1 to m, then well, this property should hold, which is that if we're marginalizing out the likelihood given points 1 to n, points m plus 1 to n, sorry, we're marginalizing out points m plus 1 to n, then we should retrieve this likelihood back, right? And then they use these properties to, oh, got a chat question, if I can see.
He's asking if you can zoom out.
Zoom out. Okay, I can zoom out a bit. How far?
Yeah, it's a bit, I can't see anything there.
I can zoom in. Who is asking that?
Zoom in. Okay, yeah, it was zoom in.
Okay.
Cool.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I can scroll down to the bit I was talking about. So yeah, we're marginalizing out over the m plus 1 to n points in our data set of length n, right? So we're saying that the likelihood of seeing a function that outputs our subset of points is the same as marginalizing out over this likelihood here as well. And they use these properties to construct well, yeah, they use these properties and get to this equation here, which we're basically talking about the likelihood of seeing a certain function, right? The yi's are mapping from x from the x space into the y space, and we're talking about a likelihood given the data of seeing those. And yeah, this is the equation they reach, and they say, okay, we've got this equation. What can we then do with that? How can we move to something that's tractable, something that we can build a neural network out of? And they say, how about we look at these functions, and instead of saying that any random function, they say let's fix let's fix a length of vector z and make a random vector that parameterizes this function. So we've got we can then write this random function f of x is a fixed function g of x and z, where so z encapsulates all of the randomness in this function f. And using this approximation, they can then move basically to equation 6. So equation 6 allows some pretty interesting things, right? And it basically lets us think about the network in this way, right? So what we are doing, perhaps I should take a step back here actually. They speak about context points and target points. So you can imagine that your context points are your the places where you have data. They're your data points, right? So perhaps you've got a regression problem, as in down here. Your context point might be this dark point here, and your target point are all the points where you don't have data, right? So they construct this network that has what they call a latent variable z, which is the random parameterization of this random function that's underlying under the process, right? And they use the data here to somehow, we'll talk about it in a minute, get a z.
There's a question. So
yes,
just real quick. So so we're being asked, could we say that Z is a form of stochastic control? If I can answer that, or you want to answer it?
So no, if you can answer it, then.
Yeah. So Z is not exercising any type of control over the. It's not exercising any type of control over the results. It's Z is a bit of a trick that is used sometimes in autoencoders, where you have to go through a middle variable, which how do they call it here? Latent variables. Yeah. So Z is a latent variable, which means it's a transformation of the context points that will then parameterize the random function. So Z itself is not exercising control. It is a learned representation of the context that will then help you do the sampling afterwards. Cool.
Yeah.
I hope that answers your question. Go for it.
Cool. So yeah, that was actually nice and clear from Carlos there. As I was trying to say, in probably more words than that, Z is a learned parameterization of these context points, and that helps you infer the random function. That parameterizes the random function. That helps you predict these points yt, the target points. And yeah, as Carlos has said, they've sort of borrowed this idea from variational autoencoders. They say that this Z is just a vector that is distributed with a multivariate standard normal distribution. And then there's this function, the decoder function, G, that takes our random vector and the position of the target point in X space and maps it to a prediction. Okay, so something that took me a while to work out was how do they train this? And what they do is actually use ideas from variational inference, right? So they are trying to use the ideas from variational inference to learn the distributions of the Z variables. And they so they have a collection of context points and they have a collection of target points, which I guess you can think of these sort of as test data and training data. actually no, that's the training data contains context points and target points, and our test data contains only context points with the target points withheld. And what they try and do is maximize this elbow function, which is, yeah, it's telling us about the distribution of the Z variables. So yeah, we fed in a lot of examples of the random field that we're the random process that we are interested in. We've got a collection of context points and a collection of target points. Maybe it's more useful to look at this one actually. So we are looking at the context points, and this H here is a neural network. That neural network provides an encoding for us of the context points. And now we have several context points. We aggregate them, and they do this aggregation to replicate the exchangeability property of the stochastic process. They then sort of use the vector that comes out of this aggregation process to produce the Z random encoding. And then we have this decoder G, which is also a neural network. And that outputs a prediction given this Z vector and this target input, it outputs a prediction for the function at y, at x. Okay, so
can I ask something then
yes,
related
please,
to the, because there's something that was not clear to me from the paper. Oh, we have a question. Well, we'll answer the question in a second. So
yeah,
something that was not clear to me from the paper was that middle part. So further down, they say that they explain the encoder and they explain how A works.
mm-hmm.
So they say that A does averaging, but
Yep.
they don't explain why there are two paths to the Z, right? So they say that the aggregator is a normal, it's a Gaussian distribution parameterized by R.
Mm-hmm.
But then they don't say why there are two R's.
So here, you mean here and here? You mean the dotted line and the solid line, or?
Yes. So there are the three stages, right? So you have the encoder on the left and the conditional decoder on the right and the aggregator in the middle.
Yeah.
They don't explain why there are two different R's, or is it the same R that they're just deciding to split for clarity?
So it's two stages, right? They're actually, this is training. I'm
I see.
Pretty
showing
sure.
Two diagrams.
You mean the dotted line versus the solid line, right?
Yeah, okay, I see now. Yeah, okay, I see now. Yeah, okay, never mind.
That's all right. Because it took me a while to understand as well. And I think I understand that, yeah, at training time, they have these YTs, right? And so they're passing stuff through, let me get this right, because I did think I had it in my head and now it may have slipped out. So
yeah, no, I think I get it now. So from RC, if you are in inference, you go straight down to with a dotted line. So you're averaging the values from the context and the values from the inference part. If you're just training, you don't have the inference side, so you just okay. Okay, that makes sense.
But there is actually, so I think I found this GitHub repo as well that they've made, and it may actually be interesting to look quickly at the model they've made. So what they do for the loss function is to look at the I'm not sure how to pronounce that, the KL divergence between this posterior and prior, right? And the posterior is the it's the encoding when you include the target, and the prior is the encoding when you only include the context points. So I suppose they do this aggregation step to generate the prior once, and then they use the RC and aggregate it with RT to generate the posterior.
Yeah. So this is the autoencoder trick, right? You give it, so you make it encode and decode, and then they should match. So the encode decode process should match with your target, and then you're learning the latent representation.
Yeah.
So I think so. Arvid is asking whether the aggregation process loses all the relative spatial information because it's averaging. So wouldn't this be the same as just doing an ensemble of different models to try to predict this and different models about the state of the network?
I agree that spatial information is lost. Yeah, do you want to answer? I'm not sure about the ensembling.
So I guess that the question is ensembling about the state of the network. I'm not sure what you mean by ensembling about the state of the network. Would you like to expand on that, Arvid? Or raise your hand if you'd like to speak. Yeah, go for it.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I think it's quite similar to the question that Carlos asked, that essentially each context point makes a vote of what the function should like, right? And all the different votes are collected into one number, Z, or one vector. And then I think in the decoder, you take this one number and essentially try to recreate the function. So Z has all the information in there. But it, yeah, like I said, it's not a Gaussian process in that sense anymore, because all the different points, it doesn't matter how far they are apart from each other, right? In some metric.
But aren't you learning some spatial information using G? Is that not where you're learning the spatial information?
Well, but Z only feeds in from Z, right? So everything G sees comes already after the aggregation, if I understand it correctly.
Yes, but the randomness is, so the randomness, I guess the idea is that the randomness is parameterized by this fixed length vector.
Yeah.
Which is an approximation, like you say. I don't know. I suppose you wouldn't get any spatial randomness. Or perhaps you would, but perhaps G would allow the randomness to come to different areas of the X space in different ways, right?
I guess so, because after Z must contain already the whole information about the whole function, right? About all the uncertainties, or at least the way Z can change and encodes the uncertainty. It's just that, say if you would know one more point afterwards, and you have Z, you wouldn't be able to use that point retroactively to improve your picture of how the new targets should be allocated.
You wouldn't, do you say?
You wouldn't, right? Because there's no way a single new point could feed into Z.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah.
I think that I agree with Arvid in this sense, in that. So you do not have the let's call it the time information. So you don't know the causality around the points. So the fact that one point is coming after another one is not taken into account. So normally in Gaussian processes, you do like you use the context information. So when you have a point in a particular location in space, where that point is will affect the result of the Gaussian process. Here it's just averaged. So I think you're right in that you lose space information.
I also think that the G function or Z function learns pretty much by heart, right? What the whole picture is like, because it essentially learns what kind of input signature leads to what kind of output signature. It feels like I think it's not really a Gaussian process or any process at that point anymore, really.
I mean, the whole argument at the beginning is that it is a stochastic process. I don't think they are trying to argue that it's a Gaussian process.
No,
well,
I don't.
Because you can't even choose the kernel, right? So that, like they say, they do a bunch of assumptions along the way. I think they just try to say that it is a deep network, and it is also a stochastic process. So in that, I do see what you say about it not being able to capture spatial information. I would agree with that.
Do you not think that G is helping us to capture the spatial information though?
So G is a neural network as well, right?
Yeah,
so
I would agree.
And G is decoding. So how would it capture the?
But it's decoding. One of the inputs to G is the position of the target points in space, right? And so it decides how to use the randomness from Z across space.
Yeah, that's a good point.
But these are essentially, you could choose them in any way, because it doesn't take the Y coordinates of those points into consideration.
I mean, I guess
but
at
training, we're trying to minimize. Basically, we're trying to minimize the difference between the predicted output and the target output, right? So
yeah,
I guess that if XT was like it had a consistent structure, then G would learn that is the structure given enough epochs and enough depth. So sort of like what you do with a convolutional network, right? Well, no, convolutions actually do learn space, but if you were trying to classify an image with an MLP, then and you're trying to find something in the top left corner, eventually the network would learn to look at that top left corner, right?
Yeah.
Yes. So these are functions, right, on the left that kind of actually do the real work, where each point somehow gets assigned a number.
Yep.
That explains in some mysterious way how the whole function should look like. It's actually quite fascinating, really.
What you mean how H maps these points to RC?
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Because in principle, because all the results are just summed up. So each point kind of gives a little bit information about how the whole function looks in the whole space.
Yeah.
It's surprising that it works so well, really.
Yeah. Well.
Okay. We'll see about the results.
Yeah. Spoiler alert. They've chosen certain results that look pretty good, but there are results out there that don't look so good.
Okay.
Right. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you, Arvid.
So yeah, I think I don't know. I haven't gone in the best order here, but yeah, as we were trying to say, I think this is the diagram that I kept coming back to when I was trying to understand what's going on in the paper, and the components of it, I guess, are outlined a little bit lower down. So they have an MLP H, which sort of it encodes information about the process, right? That takes pairs from the X space and how they map into the Y space, and produces this encoding of them. The aggregator, so they, yeah, as Carlos said, they use the mean function here, and they aggregate all of these representations together. And yeah, they're doing that to ensure order invariance. I think that's the only reason I could find they want to summarize the space and ensure order invariance, and that's what the aggregator is for, right? And then the decoder G that yeah, takes this sample from the Z vector and the location, and makes a prediction for f of x. So these are the parts, and these are how they fit together. And hopefully I've made some effort at explaining how they train this whole thing. Yeah, it uses ideas from what's it called, variational inference, right? So we're just trying to maximize this function here. Okay, they talk a bit more about this Z, and you know what it allows them to do. As Carlos says, it's a bit of a trick that sort of opens the door to doing this pre-training. Yeah, and then after this sort of explanation, they go through and talk about related works around this topic, right? So they talk about the spectrum between neural networks and Gaussian processes. So something that is deterministic and has a lot of parameters, that's a neural network, right? That outputs one value. And Gaussian processes, they're on the other end, as they see it. And they talk about a few things in between. So you've got these conditional neural processes, you've got variational autoencoders, and this thing called the neural statistician. And you can sort of see, well, what they're trying to show here, I guess, is that all the components are kind of similar, but that neural processes sort of are somewhere in that spectrum. They're using this latent variable. They are doing the kind of thing that a Gaussian process would do, right? They're trying to understand a space given a certain set of context points, right? And what else do they talk about? Yeah, they talk a little bit about Bayesian methods as well, and how neural processes have a link to Bayesian deep learning. I've got to be honest, I didn't go too deep into this paragraph, but okay. And yeah, there's more discussion of the uses of latent variables in different models as well. And then the final little thing they talk about, they basically use it on some toy problems. So not particularly taxing problems, but just to try and illustrate what it can do. So the first thing they do, where's the plot for this? The first thing they do, I can find it, is they do regression on a one-dimensional function. So they have these sets of functions, and they train their network they basically train their network to predict target points given these 1D functions. And the hope is that because all of these 1D functions are drawn from the same distribution, that they behave in the same way, right? And that Z can learn what that distribution is. And seeing points from the curve can then help you, can then inform the network, and seeing context points will shape Z and push us towards the correct answer, right? Push us towards the function itself. So you can see that with one context point, it's sampling curves that look similar, I guess, but that are pretty far off. And then as the number of context points grow, you see the variation decrease as the model becomes more certain about what area of space in the function space this particular function lies in, right? So after that, they go on to image completion. So what they've done is take some context points from MNIST and trained their network to complete the image, so the rest of the image of the target points from these context points, and you can see that it is performing pretty well. It's constructing a useful image from the data set using these context points. And something similar from the Celeb A data set here. Yeah. Then they've done something similar. So I kind of think this is what you guys were talking about, right? You were talking about a new point not giving you any information about Z, but I guess the whole point with training the network in this way is that you can, if you get a new point, you can just do a forward pass through the network with all of your points as context points now, and that'll tell you, that'll give you more information. You don't need to retrain a whole Gaussian process, right? You can just feed your whole data set forward once, and you will get a more informed output. Sorry, Carlos?
Yeah, so I didn't find that anywhere in the text, but so one of the big limitations of Gaussian processes is that as you go further away from the from what you stop sampling, they become increasingly uncertain. Do they make any claims about what you just said about this not being more uncertain as you go further away from the
so that wasn't what I was trying to say, but I don't think they do make any claims about that. No, I think they are basically saying that they perform as well as stochastic processes in some situations, but not all, right? But they are a lot faster at test time. I don't know about extrapolating outside the range of the data. I assume if it's trying to mirror behavior of a stochastic process, that it would be pretty poor. I don't know. Yeah, what I'm trying to say here is, if you get a new context point that is inside your training range, then it is relatively trivial to feed everything through your encoder again and get a new Z vector. Got a question? Okay, 2 questions. Should we go Arvid first, since he asked first? Expect that the prior they learn is strictly defined on the support of the training process. So I think that's in relation to what you were saying, Carlos. Yeah, I'd agree. I think
I would agree as well. So I don't think they would extrapolate very well outside the training context.
Okay. Is that answered, David? I think. Is he raising his hand? I can't see.
It was raised before and he unraised it now. So.
Okay, cool. And another question from Gavin. is there a potential advantage in computational efficiency using this method? I would say it shifts the burden of computation from when you have all of your context points to back to a sort of training time, right? So if we were just trying to fit a Gaussian process to, say, an MNIST image, right? If we were just trying to fit one, then it would be expensive when we were trying to do it. The idea being that we've sort of captured some of that information before we're trying to infer anything on new points, I think. How does that sound, Carlos? Does that sound reasonable?
Yeah, that's reasonable. I think they make a comment about it in the introduction as well, about the burden. So where is the computational burden that you were speaking about? So it as part of the motivation, they say that, well, in neural networks, all the burden is on training, and in stochastic processes, most of the burden is on inference. Because you need to draw many samples, whereas it's very, like, if you have your whole function defined, basically your process is defined by it, because there are not many parameters. But on inference, you need to make a lot of you need to take a lot of samples if you want to properly approximate. I think that the picture on top, the one with all the curves, exemplifies it very well. The computational burden on stochastic processes. On top, the one with the top up. So it's figure, yeah, that one. Because you can see that any of those individual curves is not actually a very good representation of the underlying function. You need to run it. So you need to run the process many times so you can see what is the average behavior of the process, and then you get the underlying function, right?
Yeah.
So with regards to the question about, is there an advantage in computational efficiency? I think I'm gonna go with it depends, which is deliberately vague. I think it depends on what it is you're trying to model. I do not think this would work as well in other applications. Yeah.
A point that I've just thought of here, I suppose, is once you have your representation of the context points, right, you then just have to sample from your Z vector, right? So you've only done a forward pass through your encoder once, and then you sample from your Z vector and decode that a bunch of times to generate lots of samples. So I don't know how that relates to computational efficiency, but
yeah, the question is how many samples you have to take, right? We have spoken here in Paperclub before about MC dropout, for example, as a means to estimate efficiency, estimate uncertainty. So how do you make a neural network into a stochastic process? But then the burden is that you have to take hundreds or thousands of samples from your neural network. So the computational efficiency is lost. And
sure,
I imagine if you want to, I don't know how many different points you want to predict, but if for every point you have to make 100 samples, then your inference time is going to be multiplied 100-fold.
Yeah. Okay.
So I guess the answer is it depends on your application.
I hope that's not too painful. Okay. So yeah, they've done this. Yeah, I hope I explained this properly. Actually, they've sort of, when in this problem, they're not talking about the labels of MNIST being the numbers. They're trying to do a 2D regression problem here, right? So where they're trying to fill in the pixels and find a pixel value based on the 2D coordinates of the number, of the image, sorry. And similar thing here.
Yeah, so I think this is a good example for the question. So this is as well a good example for the question about the sampling. So if you see that first column there with 10 samples, it is actually, the regression is not very good. So if you have only 10,
which one are you talking about?
The first
yeah,
column.
10 context points, yeah.
Yes, so if you have few context points, you may need to do a lot of samples before you can get a good average behavior, or maybe you never even get it. So there's
Yeah.
another question of how many context points do you need before you can make a good regression. And I guess with celeb phase, it's with celeb A, it's even harder, right? Because so making the regression is even harder.
Yeah. They do mention that this probably isn't the best performance of image completion algorithms that you've ever seen, because this wasn't meant to do this kind of thing. It's just a toy problem. But yeah.
So Arvid is asking if it is really a regression. So every point, context point is classifying, and then they ensemble over them.
I think it's a regression in that you are trying to, you give your model a new set of X and Y's, and you try and work out what intensity your pixel is going to be at that X and Y. So that is a regression, right? I would say.
Yeah, I would agree that. So they frame this as a regression method. So they're not trying to classify a number. They're just giving a number of samples and then trying to see, well, if the neural process can infer the rest of the numbers, the rest of the pixels.
Yeah. If you were just going to black box it, it's a box that you put an XY coordinate in, and you get out a pixel intensity.
Yep. Yeah, they're not really ensembling here because they're taking one sample at a time. I guess that if you were to say, no, the actual result is the average over all of them, then that would be an ensemble. But here they're just showing each of the samples.
Well, so I would argue against this being, sorry, just to go back. This process, I don't think this is ensembling, because you're training the H shares parameters across context points, right? So it's one model that is trained with all of the context points, and the parameters they are shared across it, so they update together. I don't know if that provides any more insight, but
H does know about the XY coordinate.
Yes, H does know about the XY coordinates of the input. I suppose, yeah, okay, maybe that is an ensemble. I don't know.
So the input is structured, right? So XT, I would imagine it's a flattened vector, or it's the image, and it's always the same size and it always has the same structure. So YT is going to have the same shape as XT. So in that sense, it does know the XY coordinates, no?
XC, there's lots of, XC is two-dimensional, so it's like a Cartesian coordinates in the space, and YC is a pixel intensity at that pixel. But there's lots of observations, right? Or well, depends how many context points you have. There's several observations of those.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that this is just for the sake of the diagram. They make it in different sides, but the whole image goes in as one input. So you have your context points and your training point. It's just one input. So where the output is defined, it's a context point. Where it's not defined, it's a target point.
Yeah. Yeah.
Does a cluster for MNIST into 10 clusters? I don't understand.
Yeah, I also don't understand that.
Do you want to go online again? Does a cluster? Does a cluster MNIST into 10 clusters?
It is possible to get a GitHub link, by the way. Yes, I will post a GitHub link. Does a cluster MNIST? So you're asking if this encoding of the image clusters. I don't know. This hasn't been built to encode the images. There are ways to use this kind of structure to encode images, like variational autoencoders, right? So I don't know is the answer. Carlos?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure how I guess that if each MNIST number has a very different number of positive versus negative pixels, then yes, it would cluster MNIST. But I'm not sure if that is the case.
I also think maybe A will be more dependent on how many where your points are in the image or something, right? Like if all of your points are from the bottom right hand corner, maybe A will be a certain way.
Does the Z input provide a form? So we have another question. Does the Z input provide a form of interrogative analysis within a neural network that wouldn't necessarily have been available on a neural network without this input?
Carlos?
No. Yeah. So the role of Z here is to introduce the stochasticity in the network. So this is if Z was not there, this would be a traditional autoencoder. But with Z in there, you're making it stochastic. So since Z is a normal distribution, what you have on the left is a network that is trying to convert the context points into a single latent variable, which is going to be R. So it's going to be, RC, which is going to be averaged by A. And then that is going to be the parameter for a Gaussian distribution. So in that sense, this completely changes the behavior of the neural network, because now you have one input. So you have all your target points and one input that is going to be varying according to a normal distribution. But the targets are the same. So that's where you say, well, the input can be stochastic, but the target is, the underlying process is the same. Cool. So we have about 5 minutes left. So maybe we can wrap up the discussion. The GitHub link has been posted in the
I would say it's interesting. They do talk about the issues with kind of what I was talking about, right? Like they show it behaving quite poorly as a vanilla neural process, partly because it doesn't understand position. It doesn't encode position into the Z. So what they suggest is adding an attentioning mechanism to this, how you generate this latent variable, and it can help. I think I assume that's what it's for, right? So
this solves the averaging problem that Arvid was speaking of before. So now it does have information about where the points are in space and how. So it has information that points that are close to each other are actually related to each other. They're not just a random input.
And that's so I think it's worth a look, and they have all the code there for how they run the experiments. That's basically the paper done anyway. They have a couple more experiments, and then they basically say these are toy experiments, and that we urge anyone who's interested to have a go at things that are more dimensional and more interesting. So I think it's a nice sort of introductory paper into this idea. Does the variance in Z depend on A? That's Arvid asking that. So A is literally just the function, the mean function. Yes, I would say that this R vector, is any point. Well, this R vector provides parameters for the random variables in Z. So Z depends on R variance, I'd say. Does anyone have any other thoughts on that?
So we're going to have to stop the discussion because it's already, we've already been here for the full hour. The GitHub link is still in the webinar chat. I'm just going to post it again if anyone wants to grab it.
We could put it on the GitHub, our GitHub as well.
Cool. So, okay, so there were a lot of questions, which is good. Maybe next time we can actually include more people in the conversation. So thank you very much, Dan. If we can show appreciation by show of hands, that would be great. And well, hopefully we'll see you all again next week. And thanks for joining Paperclub. And remember, if you want to know more about Nplant, please visit our website, nplant.io, and you can find our contact information there as well. Cool. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
See you.